And I joined not too far after Tobin. I remember we joined the research team in particular. And I think we were both kind of like figuring out what is this program? We got some initial information, but there's a lot of like, okay, so what do we do? And I remember that initially we were tasked to build out more of the elements of the research team interactions. And I think for a lot of us, we were still trying to figure out what is the direction that we want to be in. And so I think we spent a good amount of time just taking that in. And I think what was very clear was this desire for amplifying and enhancing community engaged research, having these relationships that were being built, but there being a tension with how we defined research rigor, especially in traditional disciplines, right? And as we have received them, right? So I think part of our challenge with the research team and then beyond is balancing what that means, right? What it means to be community engaged, community driven, and producing research that's worth doing. And that doesn't have to be at odds, right? And it doesn't mean that it's a clinical trial. So I think that has been a lot of IRL navigating what are the things that matter? What are the things that are going to have impact on community in a lasting way? And how do we navigate that through data and research? So I think as we've gone along, there's been a lot of pivots in terms of what we talk about. And I think I think it was purposefully vague what research rigor was and what community was. And I think as we've gone along, I think we've meandered into more solid conceptualizations of what those things are. I think we became a lot more intentional around what community meant, right? I think there were, as Tobin said, we were building the plane as we were flying it, which I feel very uncomfortable doing that, but that's the life that we live, right? But I think people had an intuition. Okay, there's something about community that's important, right? So how do we define that? Initial ideas of how to create these teams, be more intentional about how communities are included. I know in some of the initial passes changing some of the questions that we had interviewing potential fellows or potential teams, just being more probing around connections to communities and how were teams going to be held accountable to their communities moving forward. And I think that was a very important shift. It wasn't just about like, okay, what is the research project that you're going to be able to create, but how are you going to make the work that you're going to do, how are you going to be accountable to the communities that you're a part of? As it's moved on, I think we've been more intentional about like, what does a community partner get out of this program? What do community partners need? Which has been a kind of evolving story. Again, we haven't gotten it completely right, but we are, if not anything else, responsive to feedback and what people need. I think as we've gotten further, yes, there are very specific things that communities or community partners might need, but what are the key differences between a community and research partner, right? There are some elements that are structural that we can start getting at in terms of exercise of power and money and all of those key components and being able to navigate those and maybe create ways of dispersing funds that are more aware and considering of those connections. And we developed a group, the CAB, so that kind of help advise us in terms of directions and provide ideas and new directions, lead certain things that we see as like assets for community partners, right? So we've figured out different ways to further define this community component. I think we have further to go. If we had another 10 years, we would go even further. But I think we've learned so much, right? I think there was an initial idea around this like community organizing thing being a thing and important. I think we didn't formalize exactly what we expected or hoped different teams to take away from some of the skill sets or case studies or people that they were interacting with, but they were able to connect with this idea of base building and there being power in people and being able to connect in that way. And I think as we've gone on, we've really delved a little bit more into restorative justice, because while we talk about all these things about community and like the definitions and this work and the skill set, really we are all individuals, people trying to connect, caring about key things that, we're bringing our entire lives with us into an interaction and being able to connect with one another. And sometimes that goes well, sometimes not so well, but all of this is built on relationships, right? So we've invested more in what community means for our IRL community. So that means getting to know one another, not just our work, but what draws us to this work, what connects us to want to do similar work, and how we can work together moving forward. So we've invested more in that. I think so those are some of the very key investments that we've made in this program, pivots and changes.